I found out my name had been removed from the ownership paperwork 3 days after I helped pay the property taxes. At first, it looked like a clerical mistake, a PDF, a missing signature, nothing dramatic. Then I noticed the date on the file history had changed at 2:14 a.m., while I was on a night shift. What scared me wasn't losing the asset. It was realizing the people I trusted had planned this long before I ever thought to protect myself. I found out my name had been removed from the ownership paperwork 3 days after I helped pay the property taxes. It was a Tuesday night. I remember that because Tuesdays were always the longest days at work. I got home a little after 9:30 p.m., dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, kicked off my shoes, and opened my laptop at the kitchen counter. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't suspicious. I was just tired and trying to close one loose end before going to bed. The tax confirmation email had come in earlier that afternoon, same subject line as every year, same attached PDF. I clicked it out of habit, mostly to make sure the amount had gone through. Rent, utilities, groceries, taxes. I liked checking things off. It made life feel orderly. The document loaded slowly. The header looked normal. Parcel number, county seal, mailing address. I scrolled down to the section that listed owners. There was only one name. At first, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I leaned closer to the screen, squinted, then zoomed in. Still, one name. Not mine. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel upset yet. I told myself it was probably a formatting issue, or an outdated copy, or something the county system hadn't updated. I dealt with enough paperwork in my life to know mistakes happened all the time. So I opened the file properties. That was when something felt off. The document history showed it had been edited 2 weeks earlier. The timestamp was precise, 2:14 a.m. I stared at the numbers longer than I needed to. 2:14 in the morning. I knew exactly where I was at that time. I'd been at work, sitting under fluorescent lights, finishing a late shift while drinking burnt coffee from a paper cup. I hadn't touched this file. I hadn't even opened it. Still, I didn't assume the worst. I closed the laptop and told myself I'd call the county office in the morning. I brushed my teeth. I changed into an old t-shirt. I lay down and stared at the ceiling longer than usual, replaying nothing in particular. The next morning, I called the number on the tax statement during my lunch break. The woman on the phone sounded bored but polite. She asked for the parcel number. I read it to her. She typed. I could hear the clacking of keys through the receiver. Yes, she said. The ownership was updated last month. I waited for her to continue. She didn't. Updated how? I asked. She paused, like she was deciding how much information she was allowed to give a stranger. It shows a transfer of interest, she said carefully. You're no longer listed as an owner. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the word transfer sounded so clean, so official. Like something that happened between two informed adults sitting at a desk, signing papers, nodding in agreement. That can't be right, I said. I didn't sign anything. She made a small, non-committal noise. Ma'am, I can only tell you what's on file. I hung up and sat there with my phone in my hand, watching people walk past my car in the parking lot. Someone pushed a cart full of lumber toward a pickup truck. A woman loaded bags of mulch into the trunk of a sedan. Ordinary movements. Ordinary day. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I did what I always did when something didn't make sense. I started retracing steps. The property wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a beach house or a family estate. It was a small, mixed-use building on the edge of a redevelopment zone in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. 2 storefronts on the ground floor, 4 modest apartments above. Brick exterior, old plumbing, temperamental heat in the winter. It had never been mine in the sentimental sense. It was an investment, a practical one. I'd gotten involved years earlier, after my uncle pitched the idea at a family barbecue. Nothing fancy, he'd said, flipping burgers. Just something stable. You're good with numbers. You'll keep us organized. That was always my role. The organizer. The one who tracked payments, kept copies of permits, reminded people of deadlines. I wasn't the visionary. I wasn't the one who talked loudly about future profits. I was the one who made sure the bills got paid on time. I'd put in money, Real money, not a symbolic amount. I'd wired my share from my savings account, watched the balance drop, told myself it was worth it because it was long-term, because it was secure, because it was backed by paperwork. And now, according to the county, I was a non-entity. That afternoon, I went back through my emails. I searched by keyword: deed, transfer, LLC, amendment, nothing, no alerts, no notifications, no requests for signatures. What I did find was an email from 3 weeks earlier that I'd barely registered at the time. It was short, casual, sent by my cousin Mark, who had been handling most of the front-facing communication. "Hey," it read. "We're just cleaning up some paperwork on the property. Nothing you need to do. I'll loop you in if anything comes up." At the time, I'd read it on my phone while standing in line at a pharmacy. I'd nodded to myself and moved on. Cleaning up paperwork sounded harmless, responsible, even. Now, rereading it, my stomach tightened. I didn't call Mark right away. That surprised me about myself. Old me would have picked up the phone immediately, demanded answers, tried to sound calm while my voice betrayed me. But something held me back. Instead, I opened the shared drive we'd all been using since the beginning. It was messy, full of folders within folders, old drafts, scans of receipts, spreadsheets named things like Final V3. I clicked through slowly. That was when I noticed a file I didn't remember seeing before. The name was generic. Operating Agreement, Revised. I opened it. My name appeared in the document, but not where it used to be. I wasn't listed as a member anymore. I was mentioned once, in a section about prior contributions, followed by a sentence that framed those contributions as reimbursed expenses. Reimbursed, I knew, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that they had never reimbursed me a dime. I scrolled down to the signature page. My signature wasn't there. Instead, there was a scanned version of a signature that looked like mine at a glance, but wasn't. The loop of the L was wrong. The angle was off. Anyone who knew me knew I signed my name carefully, almost stiffly. Someone had signed for me. I closed the document and sat back in my chair. The office around me hummed with quiet noise. A printer whirred. Someone laughed softly near the break room. The smell of microwaved leftovers hung in the air. I thought about the last family dinner we'd had, months earlier. How Mark had insisted on paying the bill. How he'd joked about taking care of the boring stuff so I wouldn't have to worry. How normal it had all seemed. What unsettled me most wasn't the money. It wasn't even the property. It was the realization that this hadn't been impulsive. It wasn't a desperate move made under pressure. It was deliberate, timed, executed while I was distracted with work, trusting that my role was to support, not to question. I went back to the file properties. Edited at 2:14 a.m. I imagined Mark awake at that hour, sitting at his kitchen table, adjusting clauses, renaming folders, confident I wouldn't notice until it was too late. Or maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was someone else. Someone I'd toasted with at holidays. Someone who had told me, more than once, "We couldn't do this without you." I closed every window on my screen and shut down my computer. For the first time since I'd discovered my name was missing, I felt something sharper than confusion. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. Whatever I thought this arrangement was, whatever I believed about trust and fairness and family agreements, it was already gone. And the part of me that had relied on being reasonable, on being patient, on being indispensable in quiet ways, was suddenly exposed. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This hadn't been a mistake, and the version of the story I'd been living in was about to end. I've always been the kind of person who believes that if you understand the system will protect you. That belief didn't come from optimism. It came from training, from habit, from years of working in roles where rules mattered more than personalities and documentation mattered more than promises. I wasn't naive. I just trusted process more than people. I worked as a compliance analyst for a regional logistics company based outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing glamorous. No corner office. No stock options that made headlines. My job was to read contracts other people skimmed, track regulatory changes no one wanted to deal with, and flag risks before they became lawsuits. I liked the work. It rewarded precision. It punished assumptions. Most days, I sat in a gray cubicle with a second monitor and a legal pad filled with handwritten notes. I drank my coffee black. I double-checked version numbers. I saved backups of backups. When something didn't line up, I didn't argue. I documented. That habit spilled into my personal life in small, quiet ways. I kept folders. Physical ones too, not just digital. Tax returns, bank statements, emails printed and labeled by year. I never threw paperwork away just because it was old. I didn't trust memory. I trusted records. People sometimes teased me for it. "You're so intense," my cousin Mark had said once, laughing as I slid a manila folder back into my tote bag after a family meeting. "Relax, we're not running a Fortune 500 company." I smiled then. I always smiled. Being organized had never made me popular, but it had made me reliable, and reliability had become my identity. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids. I lived alone in a small rented townhouse 10 minutes from work. 2 bedrooms, beige carpet, a narrow backyard that backed up to a line of trees. On weekends, I did laundry, meal prepped, and took long walks through the neighborhood while listening to podcasts about consumer protection laws and corporate ethics. It wasn't a flashy life, but it was mine, stable, predictable, and that mattered to me because growing up, stability had been scarce. My parents divorced when I was 13. Nothing explosive. Just a slow erosion that ended in silence and separate apartments. My mother moved out of state. My father stayed close but emotionally distant, the kind of man who showed love by paying bills on time and avoiding conflict at all costs. Family gatherings became smaller, then louder, then more performative as extended relatives tried to fill the gaps. Roles solidified. There were the talkers, the planners, the entertainers, and there was me. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who sent reminders. The one who handled logistics so others didn't have to. When my aunt passed away years later, I was the one who helped her husband sort through paperwork he didn't understand. When Mark floated the idea of investing in the property, I was the one who read the preliminary documents before agreeing. I didn't do it to gain control. I did it because chaos made me anxious, and order made me feel safe. That's why the idea that I had somehow missed something so significant felt impossible at first. I replayed every conversation in my head: the initial proposal, the follow-up emails, the group calls where we discussed rent increases and maintenance costs, the casual jokes about who was good with numbers and who was good with people. I remembered Mark saying, more than once, "You're the backbone of this thing." At the time, I'd taken it as a compliment. Now, it sounded like a warning. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how invisible my contributions had been, even as they were essential. I didn't collect checks. I didn't negotiate leases. I didn't pose for photos in front of the building when a new tenant moved in. I tracked compliance deadlines. I reconciled expenses. I flagged discrepancies that saved money quietly, without applause. I told myself that was fine. That impact didn't need recognition to be real. But impact without protection is just exposure. That afternoon, after discovering the revised operating agreement, I didn't confront anyone. I went back to my desk and finished my workday like nothing had changed. I reviewed a shipment audit. I sent a memo about updated federal guidelines. I logged out at 5:02 p.m. and drove home. On the drive, I noticed things I usually ignored: a construction crew blocking half the road, a billboard advertising a personal injury lawyer with the slogan, "We fight for you." A man jogging with a stroller, earbuds in, completely absorbed in his own rhythm. Life went on, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred in mine. When I got home, I didn't pour a glass of wine or call a friend. I made dinner, pasta, jarred sauce, a side salad I barely touched. I ate standing at the counter, scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything. Afterward, I pulled the physical folders out of the hall closet and spread them across the dining table. There it all was: wire transfer confirmations, email threads printed and annotated, notes from meetings I'd taken for my own reference, dates and times scribbled in the margins. I lined everything up chronologically. The pattern was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Decisions had started happening without me long before my name disappeared from the paperwork. Small ones at first. A contractor hired without my input. A lease renewal negotiated and finalized before I was looped in. Each time, I'd been informed after the fact, always politely, always with the assurance that it was nothing major. I had accepted that explanation because I trusted the people involved and because I believed my role was to support, not to lead. That belief had been used against me. What unsettled me most was how reasonable it all looked on the surface. No dramatic emails, no hostile language, no obvious red flags. Just a slow narrowing of access, a quiet redirection of authority. If I hadn't worked in compliance, if I hadn't been trained to look for deviations instead of explosions, I might never have noticed until it was too late to do anything at all. And maybe that had been the plan. I thought about Mark again. About the way he spoke, always confident, always calm. About how people gravitated toward him because he made things sound simple. I wondered when he had stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as an obstacle. Or worse, as a resource he could extract value from without consequence. That night, I slept badly. Not because I was panicked, but because my mind wouldn't stop reorganizing itself around a new reality. By morning, one thing was clear. The version of myself who believed that being indispensable was enough was outdated. I could either rush in, accuse, demand explanations, and force a confrontation that would put me on the defensive, or I could do what I had always done best. Slow down. Observe. Document. I chose the second option. Before leaving for work, I created a new folder on my laptop. I named it neutrally, no emotion, just a label that wouldn't draw attention if someone ever saw it. Inside, I saved copies of everything I'd found so far. Then I went to work, sat at my desk, and began paying attention in a way I never had before, not just to the paperwork, but to the people. And for the first time since my name vanished from that document, I didn't feel powerless. I felt alert. Mark wasn't the kind of person you'd ever expect to quietly erase someone. That was part of what made this so hard to process at first. He was 5 years older than me, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that made people lean in when he talked. At family gatherings, he was always the one standing near the grill or the cooler, telling stories, handing out drinks, making everyone feel included. He remembered names, he remembered preferences, he remembered to ask about your job, and then nod like it genuinely mattered. If there was a problem, Mark framed it as an opportunity. If there was conflict, he smoothed it over before it ever got sharp. That's why, when he suggested the property investment, everyone listened. "This isn't some risky flip," he'd said that first summer, leaning against the fence in my aunt's backyard. "It's boring. That's the point. Steady cash flow, low drama, and crows." I remember thinking that boring sounded perfect. The group ended up being small. Mark, his wife, Dana, another cousin who put in a minor amount and stayed mostly hands-off, and me. On paper, it looked balanced. Different percentages, clearly outlined. Roles loosely defined but mutually agreed upon. Mark handled external communication. Dana kept an eye on tenant relations. I tracked compliance, expenses, and filings. No one objected. No one pushed back. In hindsight, that should have been my first warning. When people accept structure too easily, it's often because they plan to bend it later. At the beginning, Mark looped me into everything. Or at least, it felt that way. Group emails, conference calls, shared folders. He'd ask for my input on things like lease language or insurance coverage, then thank me publicly for catching issues early. "You saved us a headache there," he'd say. "That's why we need you. It's actions and help you sane." I didn't realize then that praise can be a way of keeping someone compliant. Over time, the tone shifted. Subtly, gradually. The calls became shorter, the emails more summarized. Decisions were presented as conclusions rather than discussions. I noticed, but I rationalized it. Mark was busy. Dana had gone back to school. The market was changing. There were always explanations that sounded reasonable in isolation. When I asked questions, Mark never shut me down outright. He answered them quickly, confidently, and with just enough detail to make further probing feel unnecessary. "You're right to flag that," he'd say. "Already taken care of." And because I didn't want to be difficult, I accepted that answer. Family complicates things in ways contracts never account for. You don't want to be the person who turns Thanksgiving into a deposition. You don't want to be accused of mistrust or paranoia. You don't want to be labeled as that one who makes everything uncomfortable. So I adjusted. I told myself that my value wasn't in control, but in contribution, that as long as the work was being done properly, it didn't matter who got the credit. That mindset worked until it didn't. The first moment I can now clearly identify as a turning point happened almost a year before my name disappeared from the paperwork. Mark had sent an email about refinancing options. It was addressed to Dana and the other cousin. I was CC'd, not included directly. The language was already settled, rates discussed, next steps outlined. At the end, Mark wrote, "We'll move forward unless there are objections." I read it twice. There was nothing technically wrong with the email, but something about being shifted from participant to observer unsettled me. I drafted a response asking a few clarifying questions about terms and timelines. Mark replied within minutes, "Good questions. Already confirmed. We're good to go." That was it. No attachment, no documentation, no invitation to review. I remember staring at the screen, feeling a flicker of irritation that I quickly dismissed. He knows what he's doing, I told myself. Don't overthink it. That flicker should have been my cue. The next incident involved a contractor. I noticed an invoice that didn't match the scope of work we'd agreed on. I flagged it in an email and asked for clarification before payment. Mark called me instead of replying in writing. "Hey," he said, his voice light. "I saw your note. I talked to the guy already. It's fine." "What changed?" I asked. He laughed softly. "Nothing major. You're just more detail-oriented than most people." It was meant as a compliment. It landed like a dismissal. I let it go. That's the thing about erosion. It doesn't feel violent. It feels reasonable at every step. By the time I realized I was being sidelined, the pattern was already established. Dana played her role quietly but effectively. She rarely communicated with me directly. When she did, it was always about surface-level issues, tenant complaints, maintenance scheduling, never about structure or authority. She deferred to Mark on everything substantive. At family events, she'd sit beside him, nodding along as he talked about the property like it was primarily his responsibility. Occasionally, he'd gesture vaguely in my direction. "And of course," he'd say, "she helps with the admin stuff." Admin, a word that flattened years of involvement into something disposable. I don't think Mark saw himself as a villain. That's what made this harder to reconcile. In his mind, he was probably being efficient, decisive, protecting the group from friction. People like Mark don't wake up one day and decide to betray someone. They justify their way into it step by step, until the betrayal feels like a logistical necessity. The night I found the revised operating agreement, I didn't just see my name missing. I saw a version of myself that Mark had clearly internalized. Useful, but not essential. Helpful, but not entitled. Someone who would keep things running smoothly without insisting on recognition or power. Someone who wouldn't make noise. What scared me wasn't that he'd underestimated me. It was that I'd trained him to. Every time I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I'd accepted a summary instead of full access. Every time I'd prioritized harmony over clarity. I'd reinforced the idea that my role was flexible. And flexible roles are easy to erase. That realization hurt more than the paperwork ever could. Because it meant this wasn't just about Mark's choices. It was about mine. I sat with that discomfort longer than I wanted to. I replayed old conversations, not to assign blame, but to understand where the shift had truly begun. By the end of that mental audit, one thing was undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a conversation. It was a power realignment that had already happened. And if I confronted Mark now, all I would do is confirm that I was reacting too late. So I didn't. I kept my voice steady, my tone neutral, my questions sparse. I watched. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to preserve the relationship. I was trying to understand the system that had quietly pushed me out of it. And once you start seeing people not as family, but as actors within a structure, everything becomes much clearer. What had been taken from me wasn't sentimental, and that made it harder to explain to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. There was no childhood home involved, no heirloom, no story people could romanticize. The property didn't carry memories, it carried numbers, revenue, risk, responsibility. That was the value at stake. And because it wasn't emotional, it was easy for others to dismiss it as just business. But to me, it represented something very specific. Proof that I was an equal participant, not a helper on the sidelines. Proof that my time, money, and judgment had been worth something concrete. The building itself sat just outside the downtown core, close enough to benefit from the city's redevelopment plans, but far enough to avoid the worst volatility. When we first invested, the area was still considered transitional: empty storefronts, patchy foot traffic, a mix of optimism and neglect. That was exactly why Mark had liked it. "It's undervalued," he'd said. "We get in now, we ride it quietly." And we had. Slowly. Methodically. Rent increases were modest. Repairs were done properly, not cheaply. Tenants stayed longer than expected. The return wasn't flashy, but it was reliable. My contribution had never been symbolic. I hadn't just written a check and walked away. I'd put in nearly everything I had at the time, money I'd saved instead of traveling, instead of upgrading my car, instead of buying something that would have made my life look more impressive on the outside. I told myself it was a trade-off. Short-term restraint for long-term security. Now, according to the revised documents, that contribution had been quietly reframed. The language was subtle, legal, almost elegant. My capital wasn't described as equity anymore. It was labeled an advance, an internal reimbursement that had already been settled. No dates, no transaction IDs. Just a sentence that assumed resolution. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed it myself. That's what frightened me most. How easily reality could be rewritten with the right wording. Over the next few days, I kept digging, not frantically, not emotionally, but with the same methodical approach I used at work when something didn't add up. I requested copies of bank statements from my own records and cross-referenced them with the timelines in the operating agreement. I pulled old emails where percentages were discussed explicitly. I located a scanned copy of the original deed that listed my name clearly, without qualifiers. It was all there. The problem wasn't evidence. The problem was that the evidence existed in parallel, disconnected from the current narrative being presented as truth. In practical terms, the shift had immediate consequences. I no longer had voting rights on decisions related to the property. I no longer had legal standing to review contracts or challenge expenditures. I no longer had access to certain accounts. I was still included in group emails that discussed surface-level updates, maintenance schedules, general tenant feedback, but anything strategic had moved elsewhere. I was present without being powerful. If this had been a hostile takeover by strangers, it would have been easier to label, easier to fight. But this was something else entirely. It was exclusion disguised as efficiency. I thought about what would happen if the building were sold, or refinanced again, or if a liability issue arose. On paper, I would have no say, no claim, no protection. And if I challenged it publicly without airtight preparation, I would look irrational, overreactive, emotional. I'd seen this dynamic play out countless times in corporate disputes. The person who reacts first often loses, not because they're wrong, but because they move before the terrain is clear. So I kept quiet. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still replied politely when Mark sent updates. I still forwarded compliance reminders. I still answered questions when asked. Internally, I shifted how I categorized everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reallocation of power. Once I accepted that, the pieces started to fall into place. I noticed how the language in emails changed depending on the audience, how Mark framed decisions differently when speaking to me versus when addressing lenders or contractors, how my absence from certain threads coincided with key financial movements. It wasn't sloppy, it was intentional, and that meant it had a logic. I realized then that confronting Mark about fairness or loyalty would be useless. Those weren't the principles guiding his actions. He was operating on leverage. In his mind, I was low risk, predictable, someone who valued harmony over disruption, someone unlikely to escalate. That assumption was my greatest vulnerability and my greatest advantage, because while he believed I wouldn't rock the boat, he had underestimated something else. I understood systems, and systems, unlike people, don't care how confident you sound or how well liked you are. They respond to triggers, thresholds, conditions. I started mapping out what those conditions were, not just in the operating agreement, but in the surrounding framework: city regulations, lender covenants, insurance policies, compliance obligations that couldn't be bypassed with a signature. The more I looked, the clearer it became that my role had never truly been administrative. It had been stabilizing. I had been the one ensuring that filings were accurate, that disclosures were timely, that requirements were met before they became problems. By removing me from ownership while continuing to benefit from the structure I'd helped build, Mark and Dana hadn't just crossed an ethical line. They'd created a fragile arrangement that depended on my continued silence. That was the irony. The thing they thought they'd taken from me, authority, had actually been masking something else entirely: responsibility. I was no longer legally responsible for the property. At first, that realization unsettled me. Responsibility had always been my anchor, the thing that justified my involvement, my effort, my restraint. But then it began to feel liberating. Without responsibility, my obligations shifted. I wasn't required to catch errors before they escalated. I wasn't obligated to flag risks that didn't directly affect me. I wasn't bound to absorb stress so others could operate comfortably. I could step back. And in stepping back, I could watch what happened when the system no longer had a stabilizing force, quietly compensating for shortcuts and assumptions. I didn't articulate this to anyone, not to friends, not to coworkers, not even to myself in explicit terms. I just stopped doing things that weren't technically required of me. I stopped reminding Mark about compliance deadlines he should have known. I stopped double-checking documents I no longer had formal access to. I stopped asking follow-up questions that prevented mistakes. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't interfere. I simply withdrew. And almost immediately, I saw the effects. Small inconsistencies crept in. An insurance renewal delayed by a week. A filing submitted with outdated language. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing dramatic. Just cracks. Cracks that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. And I knew exactly where to look. For the first time since my name disappeared from that document, I wasn't reacting to what had been taken from me. I was observing what had been built on the assumption that I would always be there to hold it together. And I began to understand something that changed the way I saw everything. The value they thought they'd stripped away wasn't my ownership. It was my consent. And once that was gone, the entire structure became unstable. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to raise my voice. All I needed to do was let the system operate without me propping it up, and see how long it could last. What happened next didn't look like harm. That was the problem. There was no dramatic phone call, no angry email, no moment where someone raised their voice or said something overtly cruel. If I tried to explain it to an outsider, it would have sounded like nothing at all. Everything was done cleanly, politely, by the book. That's how exclusion works when it wants to survive scrutiny. About a week after I discovered the revised operating agreement, Mark sent out a calendar invite for what he called a quick sync. 30 minutes, mid-morning. The guest list included Dana, the other cousin, and 2 people from the bank we'd refinanced with months earlier. I noticed my name wasn't on it. Again, it could have been a mistake, a scheduling oversight, something easily fixed with a reply. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched the meeting appear on the shared calendar and then disappear an hour later, marked as completed. No notes were shared, no summary followed. Later that afternoon, Mark sent a brief email. Meeting went well. Nothing you need to action. Nothing you need to action. The phrase was familiar by now. It had become a kind of refrain, a way of signaling that my presence was optional, my involvement conditional. At work, we had a term for this kind of behavior: procedural isolation. You don't remove someone outright. You reduce their inputs until their absence feels natural. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. I was removed from a document-sharing platform to streamline access. My permissions were downgraded, temporarily. A lender copied Dana instead of me on correspondence that used to come directly to my inbox. Each change, on its own, was defensible. Together, they formed a perimeter. What made it worse was how reasonable everyone sounded while doing it. Mark never said, "You don't belong here anymore." He said things like, "We're just trying to simplify communication," or, "It's easier if there's a single point of contact." Dana echoed him, always calm, always agreeable. "This way, nothing gets lost," she said once, smiling across the table at a family dinner. I nodded. I smiled back. I played my part. Because here's the truth. When harm is inflicted through process, protesting it too early makes you look irrational. If I'd pushed back immediately, demanded explanations, accused them of sidelining me, I would have sounded emotional, defensive, like I was clinging to something I didn't understand anymore. And they would have leaned into that perception. So I stayed quiet. I let the system do what it was designed to do. One afternoon, I received a notification from the city's online portal about a pending compliance filing related to mixed-use zoning. It wasn't urgent yet, but it would be in a few weeks. Normally, I would have forwarded it to Mark with a note highlighting the deadline and any changes from the previous year. This time, I didn't. I read the notice, I saved a copy, and I closed the tab. It felt strange at first, like I was neglecting a responsibility. My instincts screamed at me to intervene, to prevent a problem before it happened. But then I reminded myself of something important. Responsibility follows authority. And according to their paperwork, I no longer had any. The discomfort that followed wasn't guilt. It was withdrawal. Like breaking a habit you didn't realize had become central to your identity. Over the next 2 weeks, more signals arrived. A tenant emailed me directly with a maintenance concern they'd always routed through me in the past. I replied with Mark's contact information and wished them well. A contractor asked me to approve a change order. I told him I was no longer the appropriate person and suggested he reach out to Dana. Each interaction felt oddly hollow, like stepping out of a role mid-performance. No one pushed back. No one questioned the change. They simply adjusted. That's how systems adapt. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the cracks would start to show once I stopped compensating for them. It began with small delays. A routine inspection was scheduled later than recommended. A form was submitted without an updated attachment. An insurance certificate was sent with an outdated policy number. Nothing that would raise alarms immediately, but enough to create a paper trail. At work, this was the kind of thing that set off quiet warnings long before any crisis occurred. Early indicators. Deviations from baseline. I recognized them instantly. Mark didn't. He was busy, confident, focused on outcomes rather than process. He assumed that if nothing had gone wrong yet, nothing would. That assumption is common and dangerous. The real damage wasn't happening to the property itself. It was happening to the narrative. The story they were telling to the bank, to contractors, to themselves, was that the structure was sound, that the right people were in place, that everything was under control. In reality, the system had lost its internal checks. And the people now responsible for maintaining them didn't even realize what had been quietly removed. One evening, Mark called me. Not about the property, about something else. A family logistics question. A birthday plan. His tone was the same as always, casual, friendly, unconcerned. As he talked, I listened for something new. Some shift, some hint of awareness. There was none. Before hanging up, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, by the way, we might need your help with something down the line. I'll let you know." I said, "Sure." I meant nothing by it. After the call ended, I sat on my couch and stared at the blank television screen. The room was quiet. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked intermittently, then stopped. I thought about how easily people confuse access with ownership, how they assume that because someone has always helped, they always will. They don't consider what happens when that help is withdrawn, not out of spite, but out of alignment with reality. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply living according to the terms they had set. And those terms were very clear. I had no authority, no responsibility, no obligation, which meant I also had no reason to protect them from the consequences of their own decisions. The most unsettling part was how calm I felt. There was no adrenaline, no racing thoughts, just a steady sense of distance. I had crossed an invisible line from participant to observer, from inside the system to outside it. And once you're outside, you start seeing things that are impossible to notice when you're busy holding everything together. I began to understand why this kind of harm is so effective. Because when everything is done legally, politely, and with a smile, the person being harmed is expected to accept it quietly, to make peace with the loss, to move on. What no one anticipates is what happens when that person doesn't fight back but also doesn't cooperate. When they stop resisting and start letting the system reveal its own weaknesses. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know who would notice first. But I could feel the balance shifting, slowly, imperceptibly, like a structure settling after a support beam has been removed. And I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about what I had lost. It was about what they had built without realizing how much it depended on me staying silent. The moment that changed everything didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic reveal, no message marked urgent, no confrontation that forced a decision. It arrived the way most real turning points do, quietly, disguised as something routine. It was a Thursday afternoon when the email came through. The subject line was generic. "For your information, attached." I almost didn't open it. It was sent by mistake. I know that now. I wasn't meant to be included. My address appeared at the bottom of a long CC list, buried among vendors and third-party contacts. Someone had replied, all without checking. Inside was a PDF attachment labeled Draft, Internal Use. I recognized the template immediately. It was a compliance disclosure form, the kind required whenever ownership structure, financial interest, or control changed in ways that could affect lending terms or zoning approvals. I opened it slowly. The first page looked standard. Names, addresses, property identification. The second page listed controlling parties. Mark's name was there. Dana's too. Under the section titled Related Parties with Prior Financial Involvement, my name appeared, but not the way it used to. Next to it was a checkbox marked No Current Interest. Below that, a sentence I had never seen before. Individual previously contributed funds classified as reimbursed administrative expenses. No ongoing authority or equity. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because of what they implied. This wasn't just internal paperwork. This was a document being prepared for submission to outside institutions, lenders, regulators, entities that relied on accuracy to assess risk. And in it, my role had been rewritten officially, not erased. Reclassified. I scrolled down to the signature section. Mark had already signed electronically. Dana's signature was pending. There was a timestamp in the footer. The document had been generated at 1:58 a.m. Another late night. I closed the file without downloading it. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hands resting on the desk, my computer screen reflecting my own expression back at me in the faint glare. I didn't feel shocked. I didn't feel angry. I felt certain. This wasn't sloppy. This wasn't reactive. This was deliberate narrative management. They weren't just removing me from decisions. They were actively constructing a version of events that justified that removal to anyone who might question it. If this document had gone through as written, it would have done something subtle but powerful. It would have made my absence look intentional, voluntary, as if I had stepped away, as if I had been compensated, as if there was nothing to dispute. I thought back to the wire transfer confirmations I had pulled from my files, the exact amounts, the dates, the account numbers. None of it matched the story being told here. But that didn't matter unless someone challenged it. And no one would. Because on paper, everything was clean. This was the moment I realized the real danger wasn't losing ownership. It was losing the ability to tell the truth later. If this version of events became the official record, any future attempt to assert my role would be met with confusion at best, suspicion at worst. Why didn't you speak up earlier? Why did you sign off? Why did you wait? I closed my email and leaned back in my chair. At work, when something like this surfaced, a misrepresentation embedded in formal documentation, we didn't rush to correct it immediately. We assessed exposure. We identified leverage points. We considered timing. We asked one question above all others. Who benefits if this goes unchallenged? The answer was obvious. Mark and Dana gained unilateral control, simplified decision-making, reduced accountability, and they gained it without open conflict. The realization settled heavily, not because it surprised me, but because it clarified what had been happening all along. This wasn't personal. It was strategic. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't alert anyone that I'd seen the attachment. Instead, I forwarded it to my personal email and saved it in the folder I'd created days earlier. Then I did something that felt small but significant. I stopped answering questions. Not all of them. Just the ones that weren't directed at me officially. When Mark texted later that evening asking if I had a minute to look over something, I replied the next morning with a polite, neutral message. Sorry, I don't think I'm the right person for that anymore. There was a pause. Then a thumbs-up emoji. That was it. No follow-up, no clarification, no pushback. That response told me everything I needed to know. He didn't want my input. He wanted my labor. And now that I'd withdrawn it quietly, he was adjusting. Over the next few days, I watched the situation with growing clarity. Another email arrived, this time from a lender's representative, asking for updated disclosures related to beneficial ownership. Mark replied quickly, copying Dana, attaching a version of the form I'd seen earlier. I was not included, but I knew exactly what was being submitted. I felt an unexpected sense of calm. For weeks, I'd been bracing myself for a moment where I'd have to choose between confrontation and surrender, where I'd have to decide whether to fight or walk away. This wasn't that moment. This was something else. This was evidence. Not of betrayal in the emotional sense, but of intent. They were creating a paper trail that excluded me by design. And they were doing it under the assumption that I either wouldn't notice or wouldn't act. That assumption was their miscalculation. Because, while I wasn't going to confront them, I also wasn't going to correct their narrative for them. I let the document stand. I let the emails go unanswered. I let deadlines approach without my usual reminders. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was letting their version of the system operate without my invisible corrections. At night, I lay awake thinking about the long-term implications. If an audit occurred, if a regulatory review was triggered, if a discrepancy emerged between filings and historical records, I knew how those situations unfolded. I'd seen it dozens of times. Not with drama, with questions. And questions have a way of unraveling stories that were never meant to be examined too closely. The most unsettling part wasn't imagining consequences for Mark and Dana. It was recognizing how close I'd come to being erased completely without ever realizing it. If I hadn't been trained to read between lines, if I hadn't opened that attachment, if I hadn't trusted my instinct to slow down instead of react, I would have woken up one day to find that the story of my own involvement had been rewritten beyond recovery. That realization hardened something in me. Not into anger, into resolve. I wasn't going to rush. I wasn't going to tip my hand. And I certainly wasn't going to save them from the implications of the narrative they were constructing. From that moment on, everything I did or didn't do was intentional. I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't hoping for fairness. I was allowing the system to move forward exactly as they wanted it to. Fully, publicly, documented. Because once a false story is committed to official record, it doesn't just erase the past, it creates a future that can't withstand scrutiny. And I was prepared to wait for the moment when someone else, not me, would start asking the questions they had so carefully avoided. That email, sent by mistake, didn't just expose what they were doing. It told me exactly how patient I needed to be, and exactly when to stop protecting a version of the truth that no longer served me. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. The mistaken email hadn't just revealed a single document. It had shown me the direction the entire story was moving in. And once you understand direction, you start looking for momentum. I didn't rush into investigation mode the way people imagine. There was no dramatic late-night spiral, no frantic compiling of files. I already had most of what I needed. What changed was how I interpreted it. At work, we call this phase correlation. You don't look for new facts. You connect existing ones. I started with metadata. Every file that had been quietly revised over the past year lived somewhere on shared drives, cloud storage platforms, or email servers. Each one carried timestamps, authorship markers, version histories that most people never bothered to check. I did. I opened documents I'd saved months ago and compared them to the versions currently circulating. The differences were subtle. A clause reworded, a role reframed, a responsibility reassigned. Never all at once. Always incrementally. That was the brilliance of it. Anyone reviewing a single document in isolation would see nothing alarming. But when lined up side by side, the trajectory became unmistakable. I created a spreadsheet, not because I needed it, but because it helped me think clearly. Dates across the top, document names down the side, columns for original language, revised language, and most importantly, who had made the changes. Mark's name appeared again and again. Sometimes Dana's. Never mine. That mattered more than I expected, because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding where I'd failed to respond in time. I hadn't been consulted. I hadn't been looped in. I hadn't been given the opportunity to object. My exclusion wasn't passive. It was engineered. I cross-referenced those changes with financial activity, bank statements, payment schedules, reimbursements that were described but never executed. There it was again. The phrase reimbursed administrative expenses appeared in multiple places, always without a corresponding transaction. At first glance, it looked like a harmless accounting classification, but classifications shape perception. They determine what questions get asked and which ones don't. If my contributions were reimbursements, then I wasn't an investor. If I wasn't an investor, then I didn't need to be consulted. And if I didn't need to be consulted, then removing me from ownership wasn't a power grab. It was housekeeping. That realization made my chest tighten not with panic, but with something colder. This wasn't about trust being broken. This was about narrative control. The next layer revealed itself when I checked the revision history on the shared calendar. Yes, the calendar. Every major decision over the past year had been preceded by a meeting. Those meetings left digital footprints, invites created, attendees added or removed, agendas uploaded and later edited. I exported the logs. The pattern repeated. I was included early on, then CC'd, then excluded entirely. And every time that happened, a decision followed shortly after that altered authority or access. The timing was too precise to be accidental. This wasn't just documentation drift. It was choreography. I didn't feel triumphant as I uncovered this. There was no sense of, gotcha. What I felt was something closer to grief for the version of myself that had believed goodwill was a sufficient safeguard. That version of me would have confronted Mark already, would have called him, demanded explanations, tried to appeal to fairness or family. But this wasn't a situation where fairness applied. This was a structure that had already decided who mattered. The most damning evidence wasn't a single document or email. It was the absence of me from moments where decisions crystallized. Power doesn't announce itself. It consolidates quietly. And I had been watching it happen without naming it for what it was. I took a week off work not because I needed rest, but because I needed uninterrupted time to think. I didn't tell anyone why. I spent those days at my dining table, laptop open, folders spread out, coffee going cold beside me. I didn't rush. I didn't skip steps. I reconstructed the timeline from the beginning. The initial investment agreement, the first refinance, the shift in communication, the reclassification of my contributions, the removal from disclosures. By the time I finished, there was no ambiguity left. This wasn't sloppy governance. It was a controlled transition of authority, executed in a way that minimized resistance by avoiding confrontation. And I understood then why Mark had been so calm throughout all of it. He wasn't worried because, from his perspective, the system already reflected the outcome he wanted. I was the only variable left. The next question was the most important one. What kind of evidence actually mattered? Screenshots and emails told a story, but stories can be dismissed as misunderstandings. What couldn't be dismissed were audit trails. Metadata. Inconsistencies between filings and historical records. In my professional life, those were the things that triggered reviews. Not because someone complained, but because the system flagged them. I wasn't interested in being the complainant. I was interested in being invisible, so I stopped compiling anything that looked like an accusation. Instead, I focused on preservation. I saved originals. I archived versions. I exported logs in formats that couldn't be easily altered. And then I stopped. That was the hardest part. Everything in me wanted to act, to send something, to notify someone, to interrupt the momentum before it went any further. But I didn't, because I knew how this played out. If I intervened now, I'd be framed as a disgruntled former participant, someone emotional, someone overreacting to a simple restructuring. The evidence would be debated, motives questioned, and the system would close ranks. If I stayed silent, however, the story they were telling would move forward unchallenged until it encountered reality. And reality has a way of resisting clean narratives. There was one more detail that sealed my decision. Buried in a lender communication thread I'd been excluded from, I found a reference to an upcoming compliance review. Routine, scheduled, nothing anyone seemed worried about. Except that the review would require consistency across disclosures, ownership, contributions, control. And inconsistencies don't disappear just because no one points them out. They accumulate. I didn't smile when I realized this. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. Because this wasn't about revenge or reclaiming power. It was about allowing the truth to surface without my fingerprints on it. I closed my laptop and pushed the folders back into the closet. For the first time since my name had disappeared from that document, I wasn't reacting to what had been done to me. I was responding to what they were doing to themselves, all by following the rules they believed protected them. And I knew then that the next phase wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't involve confrontation or demands. It would unfold through processes no one could stop once they were set in motion. I didn't need to be the one to expose the story. I just needed to stop correcting it and let the system ask the questions they had been so careful to avoid. Deciding not to confront anyone felt, at first, like choosing weakness. Everything I'd been taught by movies, by conversations, by the way people talked about standing up for yourself said that silence meant surrender. That if you didn't speak up when something was wrong, you were complicit in your own erasure. I had to unlearn that instinct. Because this wasn't a situation where speaking louder would make the truth clearer. It was one where noise would only blur it. I thought about all the ways confrontation could play out. I could call Mark, lay out what I'd found, demand an explanation. He would sound surprised, offended, even. He would tell me I was misinterpreting things, that it was a misunderstanding, that I should have spoken up sooner. Dana would back him up, calmly, sympathetically. She would say something about intentions versus outcomes, about how no one meant to hurt me, about how complicated these things get. And then the conversation would end with nothing resolved, except one thing. They would know I was paying attention. That was the part I couldn't afford. Once people realize you're watching closely, they adjust. They get careful. They close ranks. They stop making mistakes. Silence, on the other hand, creates overconfidence. So I didn't call. I didn't email. I didn't hint. I went about my days exactly as I had before, with one crucial difference. I no longer volunteered anything. When Mark sent group updates, I responded with brief acknowledgments. Thanks for the update. Noted. Neutral words that conveyed nothing beyond receipt. When Dana forwarded a tenant question to the group, I let Mark answer it. Even when I knew the answer. Even when I knew his response would be incomplete. At first, this restraint felt unnatural. My reflex was to fix, to clarify, to prevent small issues from becoming larger ones. I had spent years smoothing edges before anyone else noticed them. Now, I watched those edges form. The most uncomfortable moments came when people reached out to me directly, out of habit. A city clerk emailed asking for confirmation on a prior filing I had handled the year before. I replied politely that I was no longer the appropriate contact and copied Mark. A lender's assistant called with a question about historical contributions. I returned the call and referred her to the current ownership representatives. Each time, I felt a twinge of something like guilt. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because I was stepping out of a role I'd occupied for so long that it felt like obligation. I had to remind myself, repeatedly, that obligation without authority is exploitation. I wasn't withholding information that belonged to me. I was declining to perform unpaid labor for a structure that had explicitly removed me. That distinction mattered. There was a moment, late one night, when I almost broke. I was lying in bed, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when I saw a message from Mark pop up. Quick question. Do you remember if we filed that zoning amendment back in 2021? It would have taken me 30 seconds to answer. I knew exactly where the file was. My thumb hovered over the screen. I thought about everything I'd uncovered. The revised documents, the reclassification, the deliberate omission of my name. And then I thought about how easily he assumed I would still be there to fill in the gaps. I typed a response, deleted it, and typed again. I don't have access to those records anymore, I wrote. You might want to check with whoever's handling compliance now. It was polite, accurate, final. He replied a few minutes later, got it, thanks. No apology, no acknowledgement. That was when something clicked fully into place. This wasn't about me stepping back. It was about them stepping forward without understanding what they were stepping into. The more I withdrew, the more I saw how much of the system had relied on invisible continuity, on habits built over years, on assumptions that certain things would always be handled, even if no one was officially assigned to do them. When those habits broke, confusion followed. Not panic, not crisis, just inefficiency, small miscommunications, delays, extra emails, more meetings to clarify things that used to be simple. At a distance, it looked like normal friction, the kind every operation has. But friction accumulates. I noticed Mark becoming slightly more tense in his emails, less casual, more clipped. Dana started asking more questions, looping in outside consultants where she never had before. They were compensating. What they didn't realize was that compensation creates exposure. Every consultant asked questions. Every question required an answer. Every answer had to align with the story already on record. And the story, as they'd written it, was already strained. I kept my distance. I didn't attend family dinners as often, not out of anger, but because I didn't want to risk slipping into old patterns of caretaking and compliance. When I did show up, I stayed neutral, pleasant, non-committal. If Mark talked about the property, I listened without comment. If someone asked me how things were going, I said, "Seems like they've got it covered," which was true. They had it covered on paper. The emotional work of this phase was harder than I expected. There were moments when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I was being passive, if I was letting something important slip away. But each time, I returned to the same conclusion. This wasn't about reclaiming a seat at the table. It was about refusing to hold up a table I'd been pushed away from. I didn't need to announce my exit. It had already been decided for me. All I had to do was accept it fully. One afternoon, while reviewing unrelated files at work, I realized how calm I'd become. The constant low-level tension I'd been carrying since the initial discovery had faded. In its place was something steadier, a sense of alignment between my actions and my reality. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't acting like a partner when I wasn't one. I wasn't offering loyalty to people who had quietly withdrawn theirs. That clarity was grounding. It also made me patient. I didn't know when the inconsistencies would surface in a way that mattered. I didn't know who would notice first, or what questions they would ask. But I knew how systems behave when left to operate without informal safeguards. They reveal their weak points. They expose the shortcuts that were being quietly corrected behind the scenes. And they do it without malice or intent, just by following the rules exactly as written. That was the irony. I wasn't breaking anything. I was honoring the structure they'd put in place, fully. And the longer I did that, the more certain I became that the next shift wouldn't require my intervention at all. It would come from somewhere else. From someone who had no emotional investment in smoothing things over, someone whose only job was to look at the facts and ask why they didn't line up. All I had to do was stay out of the way and trust the system I'd believed in all along now that I finally understood how to let it work without me. The shift didn't come with an announcement. It arrived the way pressure always does, slowly, invisibly, until the structure could no longer pretend it was stable. I noticed it first in the tone of the emails. Mark stopped sounding confident. Not panicked, not desperate, just careful. His messages grew longer, more detailed, filled with explanations no one had asked for. He CC'd more people than necessary. He attached documents that used to live quietly in shared folders. Over-explaining is rarely a sign of control. It's a sign of anticipation of someone bracing for questions. Dana followed suit. She began looping in outside advisors, a property management consultant, a zoning specialist, an accountant I'd never heard of. Each new name came with another thread, another set of questions, another opportunity for inconsistencies to surface. From the outside, it probably looked like growth, like the operation was becoming more sophisticated. From where I stood, it looked like stress. I kept my distance deliberately. I didn't insert myself. I didn't offer help. I didn't comment on decisions, even when I could see potential issues forming. This wasn't restraint anymore. It was strategy. At work, we had a phrase for this: change the game, not the players. I couldn't force Mark and Dana to act ethically. I couldn't make them acknowledge what they'd done, but I could shift the conditions under which their actions were evaluated. And I had already done that simply by stepping aside. The real turning point came in the form of a notice, posted quietly on the city's online portal. I wasn't alerted to it directly. I didn't receive an email or a phone call. I found it by accident while checking something unrelated. A routine compliance review had been scheduled for the property. Nothing dramatic. No accusation. Just a standard review triggered by a combination of factors: ownership changes, refinancing history, zoning classification. It was the kind of thing that happened all the time. But I knew what it meant. Compliance reviews don't start with assumptions. They start with questions. And questions require consistency. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't forward the notice. I didn't ask if Mark or Dana were aware. I waited. A week later, Mark called me. Not casually this time. His voice was still friendly, but there was an edge to it now, a tightness he didn't bother hiding. "Hey," he said, "got a minute?" I did. But I didn't say that. "What's up?" I asked. "We're just going through some documentation," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There are a few things the city is asking about, historical stuff. You might have some of the older records." I paused. In that pause, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made up to this point. Every moment I'd chosen silence over confrontation, distance over explanation. This was the moment where the old version of me would have stepped in automatically. The fixer, the organizer, the one who smoothed things over before they escalated. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. "I don't," I said. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "You don't?" he repeated. "I don't have access to those records," I clarified. "And I'm not involved in the property anymore, so I wouldn't be the right person to ask." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't hostile. It was factual. Mark exhaled slowly. "Right, of course. I just thought you might still have copies." "I don't," I said again. "Sorry." Another pause. "Well," he said, forcing a light tone, "if you think of anything, let me know." "I will," I replied. I hung up and sat there, my phone still in my hand, my heart steady. I hadn't lied. I did have copies, but they weren't mine to offer anymore. That distinction mattered more than he realized. Over the next few weeks, the situation accelerated. Emails from the city became more frequent, requests more specific. A zoning question that referenced a filing date from years earlier. A lender asking for clarification on contribution classifications. Each question required an answer that aligned with the version of events Mark and Dana had committed to paper. And the more they answered, the more that version strained. I saw it in the delays, in the way responses were revised, clarified again, in the increasing number of people pulled into conversations that used to involve three. This was the cost of consolidation without comprehension. When you remove someone who understands the system, you don't just lose labor, you lose coherence. One afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was brief, professional. The sender introduced herself as part of a third-party review team contracted by the city. She asked if I had ever been listed as an owner or controlling party related to the property. I read the message twice. This wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a trap. It was a verification request. I replied simply. "Yes," I wrote. I was previously listed as a co-owner. My name appears on the original deed and initial operating agreement. I attached nothing. I offered no commentary. Just the fact. She responded within the hour. Thank you, she wrote. That's helpful. I stared at the screen for a long time after that. Not because I was afraid. Because I realized the story was no longer mine to manage. I wasn't driving this anymore. I wasn't steering outcomes or shaping perceptions. I had changed the game by stepping out of it. Now, the system was doing what systems do when presented with conflicting data. It was reconciling. Mark didn't call again after that. Dana sent a brief message a few days later, asking if I'd be willing to hop on a call to clear up some confusion. I declined politely. I don't think I'm the right person for that, I said. You should probably address any questions directly with the review team. She didn't respond. At family gatherings, the energy shifted subtly. Conversations about the property stopped when I entered the room. Mark seemed distracted. Dana watched him more closely than before. No one confronted me. No one accused me of anything. They didn't need to. The system had taken over. I thought, briefly, about how this might end. Whether there would be penalties, consequences, reversals. But I didn't dwell on it. Because the most important shift had already happened, I wasn't trying to get anything back. I wasn't angling for vindication. I had removed myself from a structure that no longer respected my role, and in doing so, I had exposed its fragility. That was the response. Not confrontation. Not retaliation. Reclassification. They had changed my role on paper. I had changed my role in reality. And once those two versions collided, the outcome no longer depended on me. I went back to my life, my work, my routines, my quiet evenings. I slept better than I had in months, because for the first time since my name disappeared from that document, I wasn't reacting to loss. I was watching accountability unfold without my fingerprints anywhere near it. And whatever happened next, it wouldn't be because I fought. It would be because I stopped holding the system together for people who believed they could rewrite it without consequence. By the time the consequences became visible, I was no longer emotionally attached to them. That surprised me. I had expected to feel something satisfaction, maybe, or vindication, a quiet sense of, I told you so. But what I felt instead was distance, like watching weather move in from far away. You notice the clouds. You register the shift in pressure. But you're no longer standing in the rain. The first sign came through silence. For weeks, my inbox had been busy with indirect signals, CCs that included me unnecessarily, vague updates meant to reassure, occasional feelers disguised as casual questions. Then, abruptly, it stopped. No more updates, no more questions, no more attempts to keep me loosely tethered to the situation. I wasn't surprised. Once formal reviews reach a certain stage, people get careful about who they include. Every added voice becomes a potential variable. I became a liability simply by existing. That wasn't personal. It was procedural. At work, this was the phase where organizations shifted from prevention to containment. When they stopped trying to fix things quietly and started trying to control exposure. I recognized the signs immediately. Meetings moved off calendars and into private conference rooms. Communications narrowed. Language became more legal, more cautious. What I didn't expect was how quickly the stress would start to bleed into places that had nothing to do with paperwork. Family dinners grew tense. Conversations stalled. Mark stopped joking. Dana stopped hosting. When I saw them, they looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with long days. It was the kind of fatigue that comes from constantly recalculating, wondering who knows what and what might surface next. No one said anything to me directly. That, too, was telling. In situations like this, people don't lash out. They retreat. They conserve energy for what they believe will matter most. One afternoon, I ran into Mark at a grocery store near his house. It was accidental, the kind of mundane encounter that strips away pretense. We stood in the produce aisle, carts between us, staring at the same display of apples. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. For a moment, we made small talk. Weather, work, nothing substantive. His voice sounded normal, but his eyes kept flicking away, like he was bracing for something that wasn't coming. Finally, He cleared his throat. So, he said, things have gotten complicated lately. I nodded. I imagine they have. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if searching for something anger, accusation, expectation. I gave him none of it. We're just trying to sort everything out, he continued. Make sure everything's in order. I'm sure, I said. He waited. For what, I wasn't sure. A reaction, a question, an offer. When none came, his shoulders sagged slightly. Well, he said, forcing a smile. Take care. You too, I replied. We walked away in opposite directions. As I reached the checkout, I felt something close to relief, not because he was struggling, but because I no longer felt responsible for easing his discomfort. That sense of responsibility had been the real weight all along. Over the next month, bits and pieces reached me indirectly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that the City Review had expanded, that additional documentation had been requested, that timelines were shifting. Someone else hinted that refinancing terms were being reconsidered pending clarification. No one offered details. They didn't need to. I knew how these processes unfolded. They don't end in explosions. They end in constraints. Fees, delays, conditions. Sometimes, reclassification. I never received a formal notice. No one subpoenaed me. No one demanded testimony. And that was exactly the point. When systems work as designed, they don't rely on dramatic interventions. They reconcile discrepancies quietly, methodically, until the story that doesn't fit is forced to adjust or collapse. Mark and Dana had built their version of events on the assumption that no one would compare it to the original. They hadn't accounted for the fact that systems remember, records persist. And when you submit conflicting narratives across time, someone eventually notices. What struck me most during this period was how little I wanted to be involved. There was no urge to insert myself, to check on progress, to ensure the right outcome. The outcome, whatever it was, no longer defined me. That shift had happened earlier, the moment I stopped trying to correct the system from the inside. Without that internal pressure, everything felt lighter. I focused on my own life. I took on a new project at work, an internal audit that required weeks of careful review. I went back to running in the mornings. I redecorated my living room, moving furniture simply because I wanted a different view. These weren't distractions. They were proof that my sense of stability no longer depended on holding a role that could be revoked without warning. One evening, I received a message from Dana. It was longer than anything she'd sent in months. She thanked me for my past involvement, acknowledged that things had been handled imperfectly, said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She didn't ask for help. She didn't apologize directly. She offered closure. I read it once. Then I archived it. Not because I was angry, because closure offered by people who still control the narrative is rarely real. I didn't need it. A few days later, I learned through a friend of a friend that the property had been placed under additional oversight. Not seized, not shut down, just monitored. Extra reporting requirements, external review of disclosures, conditions attached to future transactions. In other words, friction. The kind that slows everything down. The kind that turns easy money into work. The kind that makes people rethink the shortcuts they've taken. I felt no triumph hearing this. Only confirmation. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do when presented with inconsistencies. It had tightened. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. For months, I had been bracing for some emotional reckoning, some moment where I'd have to confront what had been done to me and decide how to feel about it. That moment never came. Instead, what emerged was something quieter. I no longer measured my worth by my proximity to power. I no longer equated responsibility with value. And I no longer believed that being indispensable meant being safe. Those beliefs had been stripped away without ceremony. What replaced them was clarity. I understood now that systems reward visibility, not loyalty. Documentation, not intention. Authority, not effort. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to earn protection through compliance. You start choosing where and whether you belong. By the time the dust settled enough for outcomes to become obvious, I was already elsewhere, focused on things that couldn't be taken from me by a revised document or a late-night edit. The story that had once consumed me had moved beyond my reach. And that was exactly where I wanted it, because whatever consequences followed, they would unfold without my participation, without my endorsement, without my labor smoothing them over. I had stepped out of the machinery, and in doing so, I had reclaimed something far more valuable than a line on a deed. I had reclaimed my autonomy, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission. The invitation came on a Friday morning, tucked between a calendar reminder and a routine system alert. Request for clarification, the subject line read. It wasn't addressed to me alone. I was one of several recipients, listed alphabetically. No honorifics, no assumptions, just names. The sender was the same third-party reviewer who had emailed me weeks earlier. The message was concise. They were finalizing their assessment. There were discrepancies between historical records and recent disclosures. Before issuing determinations, they were offering all previously listed parties an opportunity to submit statements or documentation. Optional, voluntary, time-limited. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. This was it. The moment people imagine when they think about justice, the chance to step forward, present evidence, reclaim a narrative. If I responded fully, attached documents, laid out the timeline, there was a strong chance the outcome would shift dramatically. Ownership could be revisited, control redistributed, my name restored to places it had been erased from. I had everything I needed to do that. The thought surprised me not because it tempted me, but because it didn't. I closed the email without replying and went to make coffee. As the machine whirred, I tried to articulate what I was feeling. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to clarity. For months, I'd been operating under an assumption I hadn't questioned, that the goal was to get back what had been taken. But standing there in my kitchen, watching steam rise from a mug I'd owned for years, I realized that goal no longer fit. The thing I'd lost wasn't ownership. It was trust. And trust isn't something you regain by re-entering a structure that required you to be silent in order to function. I went back to my desk and reopened the email. I read it carefully this time, noting the language. Clarification, not correction, not restoration. They weren't asking me to reclaim anything. They were asking me to verify facts. Facts I was willing to verify. I drafted a response. It was short. I confirmed that I had been listed as a co-owner in the past. I stated that my contributions had not been reimbursed to my knowledge. I noted that I was no longer involved in the property and had not participated in recent disclosures. I attached 2 documents, the original deed and the initial operating agreement. Nothing more. No commentary. No accusations. No conclusions. Then, at the bottom, I added one sentence. I am not seeking reinstatement of any role or interest. I read it once, twice, and then I sent it. The reply came 2 days later. Thank you for your response. We acknowledge receipt. That was all. The rest unfolded without me. Over the following weeks, I learned what happened the way most people learn about outcomes they're no longer part of indirectly, imperfectly, through fragments. The review concluded that prior disclosures were inconsistent, that classifications used did not align with historical records, that corrective measures were required to bring filings into compliance. There was no public shaming, no dramatic announcement, just conditions, revised disclosures, additional oversight, independent verification of future changes, and a note, small but significant, that prior representations regarding my involvement were inaccurate. The system didn't punish, it corrected. Mark called me the day after the determinations were finalized. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was careful, measured, and noticeably rehearsed. He acknowledged that things had gotten complicated, that mistakes were made, that the situation might look different now. He said they were willing to talk about next steps. I didn't call back. Dana sent an email later that evening. She was more direct. She apologized for how things had been handled, for assumptions that had been made, for not communicating better. She said they would understand if I wanted distance, but wanted me to know the door was open. She mentioned the possibility of reinstatement, of revisiting agreements, of moving forward more transparently. I read the email slowly. Then I closed it. The next time I saw them in person was at a family gathering I'd considered skipping. It was a small event, casual, no agenda. Mark looked thinner. Dana looked tired. When they approached me, there was none of the old confidence in their posture. No casual authority, just uncertainty. "We should talk," Mark said quietly. I nodded. "Okay." We stepped outside, away from the noise. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mark did. "We're prepared to make things right," he said. "To fix what happened." I waited. He continued. "We didn't handle it well. We thought we were simplifying things. We didn't think about how it would look." I noticed the word choice. "Look," Dana added, "we never meant to push you out." I took a breath. This was the moment people imagine as victory. The moment where leverage is acknowledged, where apologies are offered, where power dynamics visibly shift. And yet, standing there, I felt none of the satisfaction I'd once expected. "I believe you," I said. And I meant it. They both looked relieved. "But," I continued, "that doesn't change the fact that you did." Their relief faltered. I went on, my voice steady. "You didn't just remove me from paperwork. You removed me from decision-making, from access, from context. And you did it quietly, assuming I wouldn't object." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but I raised a hand gently. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm also not interested in rejoining." Dana frowned. "But the review confirmed the facts," I finished. "It didn't restore trust." They looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time. "What do you want then?" Mark asked. It was a sincere question. I thought about it for a moment. "I want exactly what I have now," I said. "Distance, clarity, autonomy." I saw the confusion flicker across his face. "You're walking away?" he asked. "I already did," I replied. There was a long pause. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing in: the money, the history, the expectations. "I'm not trying to punish you," I added. "I'm just not willing to be part of something that requires me to be vigilant to protect myself." Dana's eyes softened. "So that's it?" "That's it," I said. We went back inside. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. No arguments. No sanas. Just an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and it wasn't going back. Driving home later that night, I realized how different this ending was from the one I'd imagined in the beginning. There was no reclaiming, no reversal. The system had acknowledged the truth. The record had been corrected, and I had declined the restoration. That was the twist. Not that I'd won, but that I no longer needed to. Justice didn't return what was taken. It removed the lie that justified taking it. And once that lie was gone, the rest was a choice. I chose not to rebuild my life inside a structure that had already shown me who I would have to become to survive there. Instead, I drove home, parked in front of my small townhouse, and sat for a moment before going inside. The house was quiet. The air was still. Nothing had changed on the surface, but everything that mattered had. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not because I'd been restored to a role, but because I had stepped into one. I defined myself. And that was the only outcome I was willing to accept. In the weeks after everything settled, I kept expecting some delayed reaction to catch up with me. Regret, maybe. Doubt. A lingering sense that I'd walked away from something important too easily. People talk about closure like it's a door you deliberately shut, but for me, it didn't arrive that way. It arrived quietly, through repetition, through days that passed without disruption, through the absence of noise. No more emails, no more follow-ups, no more carefully worded invitations to revisit the past. Life didn't snap back into place. It simply continued. On Monday mornings, I went to work. I reviewed documents. I flagged issues. I did my job with the same precision I always had, but without the background hum of unpaid vigilance that had once extended into my personal life. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals. I watered the plants I'd neglected during the months when my mind had been elsewhere. I went for walks without headphones, noticing how the neighborhood shifted at dusk, the way porch lights flickered on one by one, the sound of traffic fading into something softer. Nothing about my external circumstances looked like a victory. And that was the point. The most surprising change wasn't financial or professional, it was internal. I no longer felt the need to prove my value by being useful to people who had access to erase me. For years, I'd confused stability with control. I thought that if I stayed organized enough, helpful enough, indispensable enough, I could protect myself from being sidelined. What I hadn't understood was that indispensability often invites exploitation. Walking away hadn't cost me my sense of purpose. It had clarified it. I thought back to the moment I'd first discovered my name missing from the paperwork, the confusion, the cold certainty that followed. At the time, it had felt like the ground shifting beneath me. Now, it felt like a recalibration. The system hadn't failed me. It had revealed itself. And once I saw it clearly, I stopped trying to negotiate my place within it. Friends asked how things had turned out. I kept my answers brief. It resolved, I'd say, because it had. Not in the way people expect, but in the only way that mattered. The truth was on record. The false narrative had been corrected. And I wasn't obligated to return to a role that required constant self-defense. That freedom showed up in subtle ways. I stopped explaining myself so much, stopped anticipating objections before they were raised, stopped smoothing over discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. When someone crossed a boundary, I noticed it immediately, not with alarm, but with clarity. And when something didn't align with my values, I stepped back without guilt. That was new. One evening, months later, I found myself reviewing an old folder I hadn't opened in a long time. The one that held the documents from the property, the original deed, the early emails, the proof of a chapter I'd once believed defined me. I considered deleting it. Instead, I moved it to an archive drive and labeled it simply closed. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled me. The lesson wasn't that people betray you. It was that systems reward silence until they don't, and that clarity comes from understanding when participation becomes self-erasure. I hadn't reclaimed what was taken. I had reclaimed myself. That distinction mattered more than anything else. There was a moment, sitting alone on my back steps one quiet Saturday morning, when it fully sank in. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology. Not for recognition. Not for restoration. I had stopped measuring justice by outcomes that required other people's cooperation. Justice, for me, had become something simpler. The ability to walk away without needing permission. The ability to say no without a justification speech. The ability to trust my own perception, even when it disrupted familiar structures. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I exited. And in doing so, I learned something no document could ever record. Power isn't what you hold on paper. It's what you refuse to hold at the cost of your own integrity. The story didn't end with a confrontation or a celebration. It ended with quiet mornings, steady routines, and a sense of internal alignment I hadn't realized I was missing. If there was a collapse, it wasn't dramatic. It was the collapse of an old belief that safety comes from being agreeable, from being indispensable, from staying inside systems that quietly diminish you. That belief fell away. What replaced it was lighter, stronger. I no longer needed to be seen to know who I was. And that, finally, felt like freedom.